Hi, I'm Dr. Parikh, and I'm talking now about how to critique a literature. Really, it's about how do you rank the sections of the discussion. So I'm looking, let me make this normal size. So I'm here in Blackboard, and I'm looking at the templates and examples. And I already have pulled up a couple of example papers, but I'm also going to show you where I found my template. So under the templates, you can see there's a discussion outline. There's no file that says discussion template because you just want to look at the this first template, the one that's the literature review paper. You'll just write your discussion section right in there when you get started. So I've already got my discussion outline started. So we'll talk about the outline and then we'll go look at some of the sample papers, and we might kind of go back and forth a bit. The discussion section is the hardest section to understand what you're supposed to do, but it's the easiest section to write once you get it. And so I've created a lot of different resources. I've said before, it's good because the outlines are written independently of the template. So you kind of get two different ways for me to tell you. So if the first one doesn't work for you, look at the other one. And then you also have these sample papers to be guidelines for you too. So I've really broken down paragraph by paragraph. First, I expect in the discussion section a summary paragraph. So something to take a breath and remind the reader of the main purpose and main themes. And I've talked already, it feels silly in a training wheels paper that's this short, but it's a good habit to get into for when you get into longer papers. And I talk through basically, it's very simple. It's the same kinds of things that you've put in your abstract in your roadmap paragraph, just rewritten a little with more of a summarizing tone and making sure that you're not just copying and pasting. You're writing the same kinds of ideas, but you're doing it in a slightly different way. And that takes time and effort. So limitations is the first section. So there's three sections: limitations, professional applications, and future research. And limitations and future research are very closely connected. Let me bump that down to the next page to make it a little easier, and let me blow it up a little bit more. As always, I recommend that you watch this video sitting at your computer with documents open, actively working on your paper. I think you can do a lot of 2-for-1 in this class. So limitations are really what the article did wrong. And sometimes students are hesitant for a few reasons. Maybe they feel like, well, I'm just, a first or second year student. How can I critique what somebody with a PhD usually has done? And sometimes students just don't want to come across as mean, I think. Sometimes students are like, it was a really good paper. And sometimes students just don't want to think that hard about it. It seems good on the surface because you're not that familiar with it. Sure, sounds wonderful. But it's really, so it's important. An important part of scientific thinking is being able to understand what's a well-done study and what's not a well-done study. Also, it's not that hard once you kind of get the hang of it. For more advanced students, like when I look at a study, I think about things like, did they choose appropriate measures? And I look at the psychometrics, kind of the measures of how well the measure functioned. I'll look at the Cronbach's alpha, which says how consistent the answers were. So it's not like, okay, I answered one way for half of the test, but a completely different way for the other half. And so my numbers are all weird, and this test is probably not measuring one specific thing. Or just like, okay, this is an old measure. Everyone else is using this other measure that's better. Why didn't you use it? You can also, as you become more advanced, you can critique the way that they did the statistics. When you take stats, you'll hear about how there's different sort of expectations or assumptions. So you need to have a normally distributed population, or you need to have a random sample, and very few of our samples are truly random. It's really hard. Most samples have bias, which means some people have a greater chance of being included than others, and those people who have a greater chance may be different. For example, if I'm doing, let's say I'm doing research at a small private university in the Midwest. We know a few things about the populations that I'm likely to get. We know they're likely to be young, likely to be in that sort of 18 to 24 range. We know they're probably going to be reasonably well educated. They've got at least some college. We know that they come from somewhat high income households, at least higher than usual, because private college is college in general is expensive. Private colleges are also expensive, especially if it's a campus where almost everybody lives on campus. That's more expensive too. And so if we're in the Midwest at a private college, it's likely to be majority or more of a majority than it should be overrepresenting Caucasian individuals. And you're representing people from just one part of the country when every part of the country, is different. We may be more likely to get certain religious groups, certain political groups based on where we are. And so you need to think really hard about where your population is coming from. For example, a lot of people have PTSD. Not everybody comes in for treatment. And so if you're only advertising in clinics, you're missing people who may be significantly different from people who are not coming in for treatment but do have PTSD. And so it's really important to think about the ways that our samples are biased. Almost every sample is biased. And so you need to look, and that's honestly, so I mentioned stats. That's another higher order thing to say, okay, can you actually, were these statistics valid? Did you do them correctly? And were the conclusions you drew appropriate given what statistics you had? For students who are first and second year psych students writing their first papers or second papers, the easiest place to look for is the bias in the participants and the data collection. I already gave you a few examples. You can look at, for example, ADHD research very often focuses on boys, and we know that girls present with ADHD in a way that's somewhat different than boys. They tend to be more inattentive rather than overly energetic. And so they're still missing class material, but the teacher doesn't mind so much because they're just sitting at their desk daydreaming or, being distracted by different activities rather than getting up and running around the room. So we know that girls are underdiagnosed. We know that girls, they present differently, and it's very possible that they need different kinds of treatments than boys. For example, with medication, we know, for example, blood pressure medication, we know works differently for people of African American descent versus Caucasian descent. And so when you don't have all people represented in research, you don't find those differences and you don't find treatments and evidence that works for everybody. It's really important to include everybody when you're doing research. So when you're looking at your studies, the easiest place to start is who was included and who wasn't. Another easy place to think is what variables are missing. And this might be a place for you to kind of subtly include your opinion. So you may say, for example, okay, these studies all looked at race, but nobody looked at income, because a lot of differences in the US that look like racial differences, are actually tied to income. And once you control for those differences in income, because some races tend to have more money than others, once you control for that difference, a lot of racial differences go down or get a lot smaller. So you can look to see what variable they're missing. You can look to see, okay, 2 or 3 of my studies all included this one variable. All of them looked at a history of anxiety, say. So prior history of anxiety in PTSD. And this last study didn't. You can critique it to say, other studies in this field included this variable, this study didn't. For limitations, you need to find 3 of them. So I expect you to find 3 limitations, and you need to cite for each study. So tell me what each one did right and wrong, or tell me what each one did wrong or what was missing. Don't tell me what they should have done this. Just tell me they did not do this thing, or they were limited by this, or they excluded this group. End of story. Usually the limitation section is a third to half a page long paragraph. That tends to be enough. And you need 3, partly because these should be fairly easy to write, and also because I think this is a really important skill, so I wanted you to really emphasize limitations. Next are professional applications. These you only need 2. This is, again, probably the most challenging part of the most challenging section to wrap your head around. Once you wrap your head around it, it's not too bad to actually do. So professional applications is where you take your main points, so the things you've been talking about, and you say, what does this mean in the real world? Specifically, who should do their job differently because this information is in the world? So, and this is professionals, so people who have degrees, typically people who have a license of some sort. So we're talking, obviously you can talk about psychologists, therapists, counselors, social workers, marriage and family therapists. Those are all completely fair game. But you can also talk about other groups. Common groups that fit for the papers that students write in this class include teachers, school counselors are another easy one, nurses, pediatricians, primary care doctors, and those 3 are all medical providers, but they see a lot more people than we do. For example, let's take postpartum depression. A doctor is much more likely to come into contact with, they come into contact with a lot of women who have recently given birth. Counselors only see the ones who either had a pre-existing mental health condition or are already saying, okay, I think I have postpartum depression or some sort of issue. And so it's really important that doctors and pediatricians are screening for things. And doctors and pediatricians are wonderful, but nurses are really the ones on the front lines who see a lot of people and interact with a lot of people. So you could do those. Religious leaders are often reasonable to include. School administrators, so like principals. Sometimes I'll even include legislators. So I'll say, legislators can do this to help protect people, make people safe, make care more available, whatever. So those are some of the most common ones that I find that fit for papers that students do. The other important thing to do is to not give, or let me, real quick, so with professionals, what's important is to not direct it to parents or patients. So don't say parents should do this with their teens. Now there's a workaround. If you want to recommend something to parents, you can just say, school counselors can recommend, or, marriage and family therapists or whatever can recommend to parents that they do blah, blah, blah. That's legit. That's fine. But you can't talk directly to parents because parents aren't reading your article. This is as if it's being published in a scientific journal. I'm one of the few parents who's going to be reading those scientific journals, and that's only because I am not only a psychology PhD, but I'm also a big nerd. But for the most part, even I as a parent will be reading websites, magazines, things like that. That's not what you're writing for. You're writing for things that professionals are going to read, people who are looking for this information to help them do their job better. Number 2 is that you need to do something that's really specific to what you've recommended. So if you talked about some specific piece about postpartum depression, for example, you would not then just give general advice. You would not say, people with depression should work on getting good quality sleep and eating a healthy, balanced diet and getting some exercise during the day. Now, those are blanket, almost anyone who walks into any sort of mental health office could get that advice, and if they followed it, it would help them. But unless you were specifically talking in your paper, unless the focus of your paper was how sleep quality, exercise, and nutrition can help with depression, you have no business talking about it in your discussion. For one, you have no authority, and students are often just listing really general things that they kind of already sort of know, which is not what you're supposed to be doing here. You're supposed to be using evidence to make your recommendation. So if you are researching exercise, you could recommend, so you might talk about doctors, you might talk about counselors, And you might, say, look at what you found and figure out how to turn that into a recommendation. And one of the recommendations can just be for doctors or nurses to screen for it. So for example, if you find that the moms who are getting regular exercise after giving birth have lower rates of depression, I don't know if that's true, I'm just making this stuff up. But if that was what you found, that's what the literature was finding, then your recommendation might be that physicians and nurses who work with women who have recently given birth should ask how much exercise the woman is getting. And don't use the word should. I know I just used it. But say could, can, may, things like that. You don't want to give a command that you should or shall do this. So those are the two parts. First, you need to aim it at a professional. Second, it needs to really make sense specific to the main points you were making. The last section is future research. Now it's weird because you've got professional applications in the middle, but this is really like part B of your limitations. You're going to pick 2 of your limitations. So 3 limitations, 2 professional applications, 2 future research. Pick 2 of your limitations and word them as like the opposite. Like future studies can do, again, don't use should, can do this. You're basically saying, how can you follow up on limitations? And just like under limitations, you didn't say what they should do instead. Under future research, you don't need to cite specific articles unless you are saying, future research can continue to use this measure like these people did. But if you're just making a general recommendation, you probably won't need to cite something. You would just say what future research can do to spread things. So for example, if I critiqued that that girls were underrepresented in the ADHD research, my future, so I would say, these studies, and I would cite them, did not, underrepresented girls or, only had 25% female participants. And then under future research, I would say future studies can better represent or can include or can focus on girls with ADHD and how their experiences may differ from boys with ADHD. So it's very separate. You say what was missing in one, you say what can be done in the other. This is for your literature review. When you transform this into your research proposal, you're actually going to go through and rewrite this section because now you're going to be critiquing and applying and recommending based on your specific study that you're going to design. So right now, you are building your discussion section based on the articles you're reading and critiquing them and building on them. But know that this section is going to pretty much completely get rewritten. But by then, you'll understand what it is and you'll realize this section is actually really formulaic and really easy to write. So you've seen this video, you've got 2 different written sources because you've got the outline and you've got the template. You should be good to go. If you get stuck, you can always reach out to me. And you can, as you're writing, you check in with me a lot for feedback. You do the outline and then you do the draft. But if you have a really specific question like, is this an appropriate limitation? That's a great email to send me. And remember, you want to word your email so that it requires the shortest response possible from me so you can get the fastest response. Remember the key, send me something I can respond to on my phone. And saying, is this an appropriate limitation? That's something I can respond to on my phone. I can at least give you a yes or no, and then maybe we can follow up later. So good luck. I hope I hope the baby steps are working for you so far. If you're feeling a little overwhelmed, you can always reach out. Thanks. Bye.